Hey guys, today I'll show you a science fiction thriller TV series named Into the Night, Season 1 and Season 2. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The drama takes place in the dead of night when Brussels Airport in Belgium was bustling with people as usual. A young lady, Sylvie, was awakened at home by her alarm clock. Ever since the accidental death of her boyfriend, Sylvie had been in low spirits. Tonight, she was set to board a flight to Moscow, carrying her boyfriend's ashes. However, at the airport entrance, she bumped into a stern-looking man who hurried toward the terminal. He then located an airport staff member and revealed that he was a NATO officer. In a rush, the officer told the ticket agent that he needed to go west, as far west as possible. After purchasing his ticket, the officer sat in the airport bar, visibly anxious as he waited for his flight. The news on the bar's TV displayed a horrific scene, countless people mysteriously collapsing. Moreover, a popular social media influencer named Melanie planned to head to Moscow and discovered that a friend she was chatting with in New York had suddenly gone silent. The officer cursed under his breath, saying it's too late, and then he turned and entered the terminal. After attacking a security guard, he brandished a gun and stormed into the boarding gate, hijacking the plane bound for Moscow. He ordered the flight attendant to take off immediately. In this way, the officer's actions intertwined the destinies of a group of otherwise unrelated people. Although he had successfully commandeered the aircraft, the pilot had left earlier to check on ground operations. Furthermore, during a scuffle with the co-pilot, Mathieu, the officer fired a shot, injuring his left hand and destroying the radio. Under these circumstances, takeoff was impossible. The officer burst out of the cockpit and shouted at the remaining passengers who could fly this thing. They need a pilot now, and it's a matter of life and death. Then Sylvie slowly raised her hand. It turned out she had once flown helicopters in the military. Though not a pilot, in this desperate situation, she was the best hope they had. The officer pointed his gun at Sylvie, ushering her into the cockpit. Meanwhile, the co-pilot Mathieu tried to call the control tower to request takeoff, but found they had lost contact with the ground. Without time to ponder why, the two had to get the plane into the sky under the officer's threat. Once airborne, the officer's demeanor gradually calmed. He introduced himself to Mathieu as Gallo, indeed a major assigned to NATO. He said in desperation that he knew it sounds crazy, but it's true. As soon as the sun rises, they're all dead. This was the information he had overheard at NATO. People in Asia and the Americas had already been decimated by the mutated solar radiation. While the cockpit was no longer on a knife edge, the passengers outside were still very afraid. Sitting next to a young Arab boy was an old passenger, Richard, who muttered nervously. Another elderly man took his medicine under the care of his caretaker named Laura. The influencer Melanie quietly conversed with a man named Horst, sitting next to her. Sylvie's neighbor was a heavy-looking man named Ayaz. At this time, a flight attendant was comforting the passengers one by one in the aisle. When she reached Richard, he suddenly handed her a note that read, "The terrorist is sitting next to him." The flight attendant looked back discreetly, but could not be sure whether the terrorist was Ayaz on the left or the Arab boy on the right. She could only head to the front of the plane to inform the aircraft mechanic of this alarming message. At the same time, Sylvie in the cockpit made an excuse to find a doctor for the injured Mathieu and left the cockpit. Although there was no doctor on the plane, there was a home care nurse, Laura, who had been giving medicine to the elderly man. After coming to the cockpit, Mathieu received treatment from Laura while pleading with Major Gallo not to tell the passengers about the sun disaster so as to avoid panic on the flight. He needed a stable flying environment to ensure the safety of the passengers. However, a Russian mother among the passengers named Zara couldn't sit still. Her son needed to undergo surgery in Moscow the next day, or he would be close to death. Zara hysterically yelled at Gallo, but was pulled down by a flight attendant. Now was not the time to cause a dispute. After cauterizing and sealing Mathieu's wound, Laura returned to her seat. At this moment, Ayaz suddenly grabbed her and said that he heard about the sun. Hearing this, Laura was stunned. She had also heard Gallo talking about the sun while treating the wound. The plane was about to experience another wave of chaos. The anxious Arab boy suddenly clutched his stomach and collapsed in pain on the floor. During the commotion, Ayaz seized Gallo's gun and forced him into the lavatory. Afterward, Ayaz pointed the gun at Mathieu, demanding to know the truth. Mathieu explained that Major Gallo was a mentally ill patient, and he didn't believe the claims that exposure to the sun would lead to death. Ayaz believed Mathieu's words and handed the gun back to him. Mathieu demonstrated extreme professionalism, comforting the passengers before returning to the cockpit, intending to call the nearest control tower or Interpol. But the radio had been damaged long ago. Mathieu decided to temporarily fly towards Reykjavik, the capital of Iceland, the Arab boy lying on the ground. Laura didn't understand Arabic, but luckily, a man in the yellow hat on the plane did and rushed to help treat the boy. Unbeknownst to them, the plane had already reached Iceland, but what awaited them was not hope, but fire and ruins. Reykjavik airport had been destroyed, and the plane could not land. Mathieu and Sylvie had to turn the plane around. The passengers realized the plane had not landed and began to panic. They remembered Gallo was locked in the lavatory, wondering if what he said was true. Mathieu instructed Sylvie to replan their route according to the remaining fuel and find the nearest landing point. He then left the cockpit to release Major Gallo. Mathieu asked what exactly was going on out there, but Gallo ordered Mathieu to give him back his gun before he would speak. Mathieu complied reluctantly. After getting the gun, Gallo finally revealed that if the sun rises, they will all die, so they must keep flying west. Sylvie came out and told Mathieu that they were running out of fuel. Even reaching the nearest Kinloss airport in northern Scotland was going to be very difficult. Mathieu motioned for the passengers to return to their seats and remain calm, saying he would try to fly the plane lower and slower and ask them to trust the pilots. Despite his words, the passengers were still very low in spirits, with some praying and others recording videos, wanting to do something for the last time before they died. Sylvie, Mathieu, and the mechanic discuss their plans after reaching Kinloss Airport. Mathieu wants the mechanic to join him in refueling quickly so they can continue flying, but the mechanic wants to return to Brussels, where his wife remains. For now, the matter with Gallo is put on hold, but the issue with the unconscious Arab boy is still unresolved. Ayaz steps forward to help, and the man in the yellow hat leans over the boy, listening to his muddled speech. Suddenly, the man in the yellow hat tells Laura and Ayaz that he thinks the boy is saying he swallowed a diamond. The plane has now arrived at Kinloss Airport, but there's not a soul in sight. Mathieu has no choice but to make an emergency landing. In a heart-stopping moment, the plane stops just in time. Ignoring the flight attendant's warnings, the passengers slide down the evacuation slides. On the ground, they turn on their mobile phones, only to find that everything Major Gallo said was true. The sun disaster has indeed happened. Before they can make their way back to the cabin, a military vehicle approaches from the distance. 3 soldiers disembark and inquire about the situation. After learning that the outside world has been destroyed, they decide to join the passengers on the plane, flying off into the night. The scene shifts to the mechanic's memories. He and his wife are deeply in love, and she is pregnant with their child. But due to a twist of fate, they are separated. Back in the present, the mechanic frantically calls his wife, urging her to head toward the darkness. Elsewhere on the plane, the Arab boy seems to have stopped breathing. Watching the young life fade away before her, Laura breaks down in tears. Back at the airport, the 3 soldiers are negotiating with the co-pilot Mathieu. They are all professionals in aviation, and joining the team would be beneficial for everyone. However, the mechanic is reluctant. He alone wants to return to Brussels. Helplessly, Mathieu reveals that the soldiers have just confirmed what Gallo had said on the plane. Even those hiding in bunkers cannot escape their fate. The implication is clear. His wife's chances are slim. Hearing this, not just the mechanic, but all the passengers are in despair. Now they can only follow Mathieu's lead. After reaching an agreement, Mathieu instructs the soldiers and passengers to enter the airport and scavenge for any useful supplies. Influencer Melanie is lucky enough to find a bottle of vintage liquor and sneakily stashes it in her bag. At that moment, tragedy strikes. The Russian mother Zara, whose son needs surgery in Moscow, refuses to return to the plane. She does not believe the ludicrous claim that the son can kill and stubbornly chooses to stay at Kinloss Airport. Sylvie goes to persuade Zara to leave, but Zara becomes agitated. With no other choice, Sylvie has to restrain her, instructing others to forcibly carry her back to the plane. They cannot bear the thought of leaving 2 lives to be lost in such an unclear situation. Afterward, the flight attendant closes the cabin door and the plane begins its second journey. The camera moves to the cockpit, where the soldiers analyze the best latitudinal and longitudinal routes for the plane. They reason that the closer to the equator, the greater the circumference of the Earth, and consequently, the harder it is to escape the clutches of the sun. Sylvie leaves the cockpit to check on Ayaz, who is outside repairing the radio. The mechanic has become despondent, so the heavy work falls to the 3 soldiers and the men in the cabin. Later, Sylvie chats with the sick little boy, comforting him that everything will be all right. Eventually, Sylvie finds the mechanic, who has just lost his wife forever. It's not surprising that he has given up on life, but Sylvie uses her own painful past to inspire him. The journey was supposed to be a sweet one with her boyfriend, but he suddenly passed away. Sylvie even considered ending her own life, but ultimately persevered. She hopes the mechanic can do the same. Reinvigorated, the mechanic joins Ayaz and soldiers in repairing the radio. Meanwhile, Horst has fixed the plane's wireless network. It seems the passengers truly are a talented bunch. With the network back up, everyone pulls out their phones to check for messages, but Melanie finds that even after an hour, she hasn't received a single one. The flight attendant, however, receives a farewell text from her child. Richard reads out a news report from an hour ago, which mentions that British physicists have discovered a problem with the sun's polarity. Horst, a climatologist, tells the passengers that it's known the sun undergoes a polarity reversal every 11 years, which shouldn't affect Earth. However, during the recent reversals, one side's magnetism seemed much stronger, potentially causing a massive gamma-ray storm, equivalent to 1 trillion neutron bombs exploding every second inside the sun. He despairingly adds that the scientist who wrote the article is probably already dead in the UK. Suddenly, Ayaz pulls Sylvie aside and reveals a shocking discovery. The 3 soldiers at Kinloss Airport were not active duty soldiers, but war criminals who committed atrocities in Afghanistan. These men are not to be trusted. Sylvie considers throwing the soldiers off the plane. Then, inside the cabin, one of the soldiers starts to strip his disguise and seize other passengers' belongings. The elderly man, already not in his right mind, tries to open the cabin door to leave. In a panic, the soldier pulls the old man away, who is then harshly thrown to the ground. Already frail, the old man dies instantly. This ignites a fuse, as people think it was the soldier who killed him, given that it's impossible to open the cabin door during flight. Ayaz tries to take away the old man's body so as not to frighten the sick boy, provoking the already agitated soldiers. One soldier points a gun at him, but luckily the leader of the soldiers scolds him to put the gun down. Mathieu steps forward, once again calming the passengers and deftly changing the subject, informing them that they will land in a small town in Canada to gather supplies and new radio equipment. Another life lost, the mood among the people is somber. Sylvie enters the cockpit under the pretense of changing Mathieu's bandages, and in French, she shares with Mathieu Ayaz's investigative findings. Although the soldiers are British and don't understand French, one soldier becomes alert upon hearing the word Afghanistan. Fortunately, Sylvie explains that she was just talking about her own service in Afghanistan, narrowly avoiding detection by the soldiers. Before long, the plane touched down in Canada. According to the plan, everyone disembarked to look for supplies. At the airport, they were met with the sight of countless bodies of those who had suddenly passed away, stirring a bleak sense of sorrow within them. But time waits for no one, and Mathieu swiftly directs the division of labor. Heeding Sylvie's earlier advice, he intentionally sent the 3 soldiers to search for the radio equipment alone. The soldiers, sensing something amiss, took the mechanic and the flight attendant along with them in their search. Reluctantly, Mathieu and Sylvie agreed to their demand. Once the soldiers had departed, Mathieu gathered the other passengers, disclosing to them the truth about the soldiers being war criminals from the Afghan conflict. He instructed everyone to return to the plane as soon as they found the supplies, with the mechanic and the flight attendant planning to escape in the process, leaving the soldiers behind and taking off without them. Time was of the essence, and the passengers began to act swiftly. Meanwhile, Ayaz volunteered to bury the body of the Arab boy who had passed away. At the same time, the mechanic and the soldiers reached a dimly lit hardware store in search of the radio equipment. The mechanic found the necessary gear on a darkened shelf but kept quiet about his discovery. Now that his mission was accomplished, the next step was to ditch the soldiers. Taking a gamble, he lied that there was no radio equipment outside, sending the soldiers into a storage room to search. As soon as they stepped inside, the mechanic locked the door behind them and ran back with the flight attendant. But in a moment of confusion, the flight attendant ignored the mechanic's advice and stood there dazed. The soldiers shot their way out of the storage room and gave chase. The mechanic had no choice but to leave the flight attendant behind and drive away from the scene, with the soldiers in hot pursuit. Elsewhere, the passengers had completed their search for supplies and returned to the plane. Everyone was now awaiting the mechanic and flight attendant's return. The mechanic did come back, but the 3 soldiers were close on his heels. He jumped out of the vehicle, ran into the plane, and instructed Ayaz to close the hatch, telling him the flight attendant couldn't make it. He then entered the cockpit and relayed the news about the flight attendant to Mathieu, but there was no time for grief. The plane hadn't yet escaped the soldiers' pursuit. They fired at the aircraft while running towards it. Mathieu wanted to stop the plane for the flight attendant, but Sylvie intervened, insisting that the passengers' safety was paramount. The plane sped up, and as the soldiers realized they couldn't catch up, their gunfire grew frantic. Finally, the aircraft ascended, leaving the soldiers on the ground. Just as Mathieu felt a wave of relief, Richard in the cabin suddenly noticed a crack in the plane's side window, made by one of the soldiers' bullets, a crack that could potentially doom the entire aircraft. He stood up and yelled to stop the plane. The scene shifts once again to the co-pilot Mathieu's memories. It turns out he has been having an affair with a blonde flight attendant all along. This very attendant was left behind in Brussels at the beginning. Mathieu's wife discovers their secret, but seems to be in a weaker position within the marriage. She says nothing despite knowing, even deliberately leaving the bedroom to give Mathieu space to deal with the aftermath. Back to the present, Mathieu inspects the crack in the window. At high altitudes, even a small fracture can be fatal due to the significant pressure difference. He must find an opportunity to go outside with the mechanic to fix the crack. Meanwhile, Ayaz is comforting the sick boy. However, the boy's mother reacts angrily, accusing Ayaz of having ulterior motives. Major Gallo has been dissatisfied with Mathieu's authoritative orders and explodes after the window damage, arguing that decisions should be made as a group discussion, not just by Mathieu. Gallo also targets the airline staff and Sylvie. Mathieu is infuriated by Gallo's arrogant attitude, and with Richard fanning the flames, the tension between them intensifies. Just then, Horst, who claimed to be a meteorologist, tells them that he has discovered another airplane through the radio. Everyone quickly stops arguing, and Mathieu listens to the radio. The person on the other end tells him about an underwater sealed training base in Hawaii used for astronaut training, which can shield against radiation and has now become a refuge. Mathieu shares this news with everyone, but Sylvie is worried about the plan. She points out that Hawaii's latitude is too low. If the refuge fails, they won't be able to escape the sun's rays. Mathieu counters that the plane can't fly indefinitely. Any part failure means it's over. They have to take a chance, or they'll die eventually. Mathieu's emotions are running high, likely due to the immense stress and his arm injury. Sylvie asks if he needs pain relief, but Mathieu chooses to save the medicine for the passengers. Suddenly, there's a commotion outside. Sylvie stops Mathieu from going to check and finds that Gallo has formed an alliance with Richard and others to establish new cabin rules. They clash with Ayaz's group. Sylvie is about to intervene when Mathieu urgently calls her to the cockpit. An alarm is sounding for an unknown reason, but Mathieu can't find the issue after checking. He deduces that a soldier must have climbed onto the landing gear during takeoff and is now stuck there. He informs everyone, explaining that although the soldier can't enter the cabin, if he damages the hydraulic system, the landing gear won't work, meaning the plane can't land. Mathieu plans to resolve the landing gear issue and fly as high as possible, hoping the soldier will die from lack of oxygen. In the cabin, passengers are doing their own things, chatting or being bored. However, when Melanie goes to the water dispenser, Gallo picks a fight with her. Just then, Laura suddenly notices that the crack in the window is growing. Before she can warn everyone, the glass breaks and the powerful airflow causes dizziness. Mathieu hurriedly puts down the oxygen mask, but it's too late. People can't secure themselves, and the little boy faints. In the end, the mechanic battles the fierce wind and seals the window with a board, restoring calm to the cabin. The turbulence caused a lot of harm. Melanie seemed to have bumped his head and passed out. The little boy's oxygen tube had vanished. In a critical moment, Ayaz surprisingly pulled a knife from the luggage compartment. He quickly cut the tubing from the oxygen mask and fitted it to the boy's nose, narrowly resolving the crisis. But the danger was far from over. After this ordeal, the plane could no longer reach Hawaii. If they wanted to head to Hawaii, Mathieu's plan involved circling the globe once more, which again displeased Gallo. Meanwhile, Sylvie discovered that the soldier on the landing gear hadn't fallen off. He had damaged the hydraulic system and was sustaining himself with the heat inside. The worst-case scenario unfolded. After much thought, Mathieu decided to send Ayaz and the mechanic to the tail to deal with the soldier, but Gallo blocked them, blackmailing Mathieu into agreeing that future decisions must be discussed and deliberated upon. Under pressure, Mathieu agreed to Gallo's demands. Back in the cockpit, Mathieu told Sylvie that Gallo was an unstable element and they should get rid of him. But then he dropped the subject, asking Sylvie if she had found a temporary airport. Fortunately, there was one in the Aleutian Islands. Without considering his recent agreement with Gallo, Mathieu unilaterally decided to fly to the Aleutians. The scene shifts to the cabin, where the little boy's condition had worsened. Unable to stand by idly, Laura approached Mathieu, hoping he would lower the plane's altitude to ease the boy's discomfort. However, Mathieu rejected her suggestion. Laura then sidestepped Sylvie and informed Mathieu that the flight attendant left behind in Canada had already revealed his affair with his mistress to the influencer Melanie. Despite knowing this, Laura believed Mathieu was still a noble person and hoped he could show kindness once more. Persuaded by her words, Mathieu agreed to Laura's request. Turning to the mechanic and his group, they had made it to the underbelly of the plane. Reluctant to hand over his gun, Gallo decided to join the action himself. They torched through the cargo hold's wall with a welder and entered the storage area. Next up was the landing gear. The mechanic cut through the wall above the landing gear, only to find pitch darkness inside. As the three of them tensed up, a hand suddenly reached out from below, attempting to snatch Gallo's gun. The soldier was indeed hiding inside. Ayaz grabbed the gun and let loose a barrage of fire into the darkness, silencing the soldier, who presumably met his end. Returning to the cabin, they were met not with applause but with icy stares from everyone. It turns out that during the stopover in Canada, the airport janitor had discovered Ayaz slicing open the body of the deceased Arab boy to retrieve the diamonds hidden inside. Furthermore, Ayaz's mysterious knife, which he had somehow brought on board, now made him an extremely dangerous individual. Only Laura believed Ayaz was a good person. The situation was dire. Ayaz had no choice but to reveal that the gems were relics lost during the Ottoman Empire era, belonging to his homeland. Recently, Ayaz had learned that the gems were on display at the Antwerp Museum, so he orchestrated their theft and hired the Arab boy to smuggle them in his body. The boy's death was an accident. He hadn't followed the proper procedures, leading to his own demise by the very gems he carried. Despite the truth being told, the passengers still weren't ready to let Ayaz off the hook. Richard took out handcuffs, and a show of hands was called for a vote on whether to restrain the alleged murderer. Ultimately, Ayaz was regretfully captured and locked in the hold below. The scene shifts to Ayaz's memories of his past. It turns out he wasn't any real estate agent. He was the owner of a brothel in Belgium, and Ayaz was no pushover. He had clout in both the underworld and the legitimate world, known locally as a big shot. There had been an incident where a British man in his establishment bit a girl's nose. Ayaz had come to sort things out, but the customer was unreasonably defiant and even threatened to report them to the British consulate. When sweet talk failed, Ayaz resorted to a whip, beating the man half to death. He even paid off the police afterward to handle the fallout. However, Ayaz was now locked in the plane's hold, with the passengers above debating his fate. The plane had arrived at the airport on the Aleutian Islands. Richard was determined to kick Ayaz out. Although Ayaz wanted to defend himself, Richard shut the hatch on him. The other passengers, mindful of Ayaz's good intentions, were unwilling to cast him out. Even Gallo, who usually sided with Richard, was uncharacteristically silent. The Democratic vote, initially advocated by Richard, had now become a double-edged sword, leaving the decision on Ayaz's fate hanging in the balance. A trial was convened out of necessity. At the meeting, Richard argued that Ayaz was a criminal involved in organizing prostitution and drug trafficking. Under his influence, other passengers who were initially ambivalent began to shift their stance. But to everyone's surprise, Major Gallo revealed a bombshell secret. During his time at NATO, he not only eavesdropped on the unfolding disaster, but also learned from military sources that an official refuge had been built. They needed to return to Belgium to seek further details and documents, and Ayaz's formidable personal abilities could be of help in the journey ahead. Gallo advised against exiling Ayaz, asserting that among all present, only Ayaz was qualified for the task at hand, as the others were ordinary citizens. Thus, after Gallo vouched for Ayaz's life, Mathieu agreed to his plan, allowing people to return to the plane, ready to set off back to Belgium. The scene shifts as Sylvie finds Melanie, hoping to leverage her extensive social network to dig up the latest news on NATO and Hawaii. Before Melanie can respond, Horst approaches Sylvie with catastrophic news. He has discovered that the food collected from Canada by the passengers has turned dry and tasteless. Suspecting that the sun's mutation may have destroyed the food's DNA structure, thus rendering it nutritionally worthless, he warns that everyone on the plane might soon starve to death. Fortunately, there are still canned foods, but their supply is limited. Mathieu has been out of sorts since the stop in the Aleutian Islands, and Sylvie hopes he will share what's troubling him. After much deliberation, Mathieu reveals that the blonde flight attendant he had an affair with is pregnant with his child, a piece of dire news in these apocalyptic times. Mathieu has his worries, as do others. The airport janitor had a soft spot for a flight attendant who died in Canada, contributing to his low spirits. As for Sylvie, returning to Brussels has resurrected painful memories of her deceased boyfriend. Suddenly, the plane experiences severe turbulence. Sylvie rushes to the cockpit to inquire about the situation, and Mathieu downplays it, saying they just flew a bit too high. However, Sylvie notices that Mathieu's mental state seems off, almost to the point of madness. She calls over the mechanic and Ayaz to subdue the frenzied Mathieu. After being dragged to the cabin, Mathieu regains his composure and heads to the restroom to tidy up. It's not entirely Mathieu's fault. As the current pilot of the plane, he has slept only 10 hours since leaving Brussels, a feat that would overwhelm most people. Richard suddenly hears a series of indistinct radio waves. The mechanic and Horst rush to the radio and discover that the voice coming through is speaking Russian. They think of Zara with her sick son. As Zara approaches Ayaz to ask about his plans for the gems, she's impressed when he says he intends to anonymously return them to the Turkish government. Before they can continue their exchange, Horst calls Zara away. Indeed, it takes a native to understand, and she quickly realizes that the voice on the radio belongs to a Russian astronaut stranded at the International Space Station, a significant revelation. How he has survived in space might hold answers for the plane's predicament, and this must be relayed to Mathieu immediately. The mechanic runs to the cockpit, but finds Mathieu missing. He never left the restroom. Sensing trouble, the mechanic finds Mathieu unconscious. Nurse Laura diagnoses that Mathieu's hallucinations and seizures are likely due to blood poisoning from an untreated gunshot wound, necessitating emergency surgery. A daunting task given the lack of a doctor on board and the question of who will land the plane. With no other options, they turn to Sylvie, who bravely accepts the formidable task of landing the plane, following online instructional videos step by step. It's a risky move, especially since Sylvie is inexperienced with takeoff procedures, meaning the lives of everyone on board after landing in Brussels depend on Laura's ability to save Mathieu. With the plans set, Sylvie takes control of the main console. As the Brussels airport comes into view, Sylvie clumsily executes the landing steps. The situation on the ground is far from optimistic, but as the plane descends, Sylvie forces it toward the ground. Thankfully, everyone in the cabin had buckled up in advance, avoiding a violent impact. The plane lands amidst great danger, and Sylvie, overwhelmed with relief, weeps with joy as others applaud her. But there's no time to waste. Nurse Laura and Zara head to the hospital to operate on Mathieu, while the airport janitor and Melanie search for food at the airport. Major Gallo and Ayaz set out to investigate NATO's base for intelligence. However, Horst suddenly realizes that if the food has spoiled due to solar radiation, the plane's organic carbon-based fuel might be compromised as well. The scene shifts to the past memories of Richard. He's an ordinary resident of Brussels, who goes to work every day and looks after his mother, whose hearing is in decline. But lately, he's been engrossed in online conversations with a Russian girl, and it looked like they might become romantically involved. However, she constantly asked Richard for money to buy a plane ticket to see him, a clear indication of an online scam. The beleaguered Richard couldn't pull himself away and even went as far as purchasing a ticket to Moscow, hoping to meet her. But as one might expect, once she heard this news, she stopped responding to him. Fast forward to the present, Richard has put the failed online romance behind him and is now getting ready to head out with Gallo. Sylvie enters and informs them that their Hawaii plan is off, since Melanie discovered online that the training base was never completed. Now, their only hope lies with NATO. Sylvie emphasizes the importance of taking the situation seriously. To add to their troubles, the airplane fuel has mutated, just as Horst had warned. Now the question is where to find new fuel. Fortunately, the airport janitor is aware of temporary fuel stored in pipes under the riverbed in Antwerp. Consequently, Sylvie secures a tanker truck and plans to send the janitor to Antwerp. Before leaving, the mechanic asks Melanie to keep a close eye on Sylvie to prevent her from doing anything foolish upon returning to her old haunts. Meanwhile, Gallo and his group arrive at the NATO base, where they find the corpses of soldiers who stayed at their posts until death. They then enter the diplomatic ambassador's conference room. It's revealed that at the onset of the disaster, Gallo, whose lover was a Spanish translator, had overheard a conversation among high-ranking officials in this very room, learning that it was too late and they needed to leave immediately. But now, there are no meeting minutes left on the conference table. In a moment of frustration, Gallo slams the table and yells. The observant Richard notices that the conference room security camera is voice-activated, meaning there must be recordings in the security room. So, he heads off to the security room while Gallo and Ayaz stay behind to search through documents. But at this juncture, Gallo can't help but make some insulting remarks about Ayaz's ethnicity and his country. Despite repeated warnings, Gallo does not stop, leading to a fierce fight between the two. Gallo accidentally lands a powerful uppercut that knocks Ayaz to the ground, motionless. Gallo is terrified and rushes to find Richard. By this time, Richard has located the position of NATO's Refuge, which is supposed to be in a bunker in Bulgaria. Information that roughly matches what the Russian astronaut on the International Space Station provided. After hearing the news, Gallo pulls Richard, wanting to hurry back to the plane and lying that Ayaz had already returned. But before they leave, Richard spots Ayaz lying in a pool of blood on the surveillance footage. Nurse Laura and her group wheeled Mathieu into the hospital. There, behind a curtain, they were confronted by a mountainous pile of corpses, a sight that was both shocking and heartbreaking. It seemed people hoped the black cloth would shield them from the Grim Reaper, but it was a futile struggle in the end. After a moment to compose themselves, they wheeled Mathieu into the operating room. They moved the body of a dead man on the operating table, and then Laura began the daunting task of trying to save Mathieu. Meanwhile, the sick little boy playing in the hospital stumbled upon a living animal inside a backpack. Zara relayed this news to Horst, while Mathieu's surgery was barely a success. Though he hadn't woken up and was immobile, time waits for no one. For the safety of everyone, they took the risk of carrying Mathieu back on a stretcher. The airport janitor and the mechanic had already found fuel buried in the pipes and began to extract it. Fortunately, the fuel in the pipes had not degraded and was plentiful. At that moment, Melanie was searching for food with Sylvie. In the supermarket, they stumbled upon the bodies of a couple, an ironic end as they died in the throes of passion. Sylvie told Melanie that after gathering food, she had something to do and instructed Melanie not to follow her. When Horst called, Melanie had just seen Sylvie off. Knowing the gravity of the situation, he quickly drove the fuel tanker back to the plane. He was aware of Sylvie's boyfriend's fate and her suicidal plan. Sylvie's departure from the group likely meant she was off to carry out this plan. Indeed, Sylvie lay at home, tenderly gazing at her boyfriend's urn, quietly awaiting death's arrival. But the mechanic found her. After days of close interaction, he had developed feelings for her. His visit was not only to persuade Sylvie to return, but also to express his heartfelt emotions. After a tongueless kiss, Sylvie agreed to give up her pursuit of death and return to the plane with the mechanic. Now, with all crew members present, Gallo helped the just-awakened Mathieu into the cockpit, urging him to take off quickly. But Ayaz had not returned. On the floor of the NATO conference room, the grievously injured Ayaz was crawling slowly, leaving behind a winding trail of blood. But those on the plane were unaware of Ayaz's whereabouts. Despite Gallo claiming Ayaz hadn't returned with him, the grim wounds on his face undermined his credibility. Zara, pressing for answers on Ayaz's fate, was finally met with the truth from Richard. He betrayed Gallo, suggesting that Gallo might have killed Ayaz. Hearing this, Zara screamed in rage that she would kill Gallo, but thankfully Laura restrained her heavy body. Dawn was approaching and the plane had to take off. Zara slumped into her seat, defeated. Suddenly, in the cockpit, Sylvie and Mathieu saw a car driving towards the takeoff runway. The car stopped, and out staggered a figure. It was Ayaz. Against all odds, he had made it. The scene then shifts to Gallo's fantasy, where his mistress is beside him in a sports car, continuously caressing and teasing him. She seduces him, telling him there's no need to repent for injuring Ayaz as it shows strength, whereas Gallo was exceptionally weak in the past. In the dream, Gallo is just as he truly is, timid and indecisive, lacking in resolve. Perhaps this is why he wants others to fear him. However, after the injured Ayaz returns to the plane and truthfully recounts Gallo's actions, the survivors indeed cast their votes, condemning Gallo to exile in the cargo hold. There's also a piece of good news. They found the coordinates of a sanctuary which is supposedly hidden beneath a dam. The bad news is that the coordinates are not precise enough. They must search around the dam to find the exact location of the refuge. Once they run out of fuel, there will be no second chance for escape. Sylvie informs everyone that the plane will land at an Air Force base 15 kilometers from the bunker, and from there they'll drive to the shelter. And all this must happen within half an hour. There's no time for argument. Back in the cockpit, Sylvie finally shares her feelings, acknowledging how difficult everything has become. A person once seeking death, she now finds herself as one of the leaders of the survivors group, an irony not lost on her. Mathieu comforts Sylvie, assuring her she's doing a great job. However, Sylvie reveals that she wasn't discharged from the Air Force, but left after the death of her boyfriend from cancer, unable to cope with the loss. Sylvie doesn't see herself as a strong leader, but Mathieu encourages her once more to forgive herself and to break free from remorse and memories, to focus on the present. Meanwhile, Zara covertly finds Ayaz. She lifts her shirt, revealing a long, fierce scar on her abdomen. She had sold one of her kidneys to raise money for her sick son. Now, it's not just her son who's weak. Her own health is in jeopardy. She pleads with Ayaz to take her son if she can't keep up. Ayaz solemnly makes this promise. Before she leaves, Richard also finds Ayaz, wanting to have a private word. In a secluded spot, he tells Ayaz that he did see lying motionless through the surveillance but chose to ignore him, thinking it'd be easier if Ayaz were dead, so he wouldn't have to face him again. Now that Ayaz has returned to the plane, he hopes for forgiveness. Ayaz chooses to forgive him. Richard even suggests that Ayaz hit him to vent his anger, but Ayaz refuses. He shares that 20 years ago he was in prison, and that experience taught him that facing one's mistakes isn't easy. Seeing Ayaz's character, Richard opens up about his real reason for going to Russia, to meet a Russian girl he knew online. He excitedly shows Ayaz a photo, lavishing her with praise. Just then, Melanie walks in and upon seeing the photo, informs the man that the girl is an internet-famous model she's acquainted with. Realizing he's been duped, Richard leaves the scene, visibly embarrassed. After the minor episode, the plane was rapidly approaching its destination. Mathieu turned to Sylvie and expressed his wish that in a critical moment Sylvie could abandon him, an injured man, to help the other passengers. After all, no one would need to pilot the aircraft thereafter. Sylvie did not want to agree, but Mathieu threatened to crash the plane if she refused, so she reluctantly consented. Subsequently, Sylvie exited the cockpit. There was an urgent problem that needed everyone's attention. They needed to decide what to do with Gallo. Opinions were divided, but in the end, they unanimously decided to leave the judgment to Ayaz, as the bond between him and Gallo was the most complex. After much contemplation, Ayaz simply said if they were to die today, he didn't want his last act to be sentencing a man to death. It seemed Ayaz had decided to spare Gallo's shitty life. With conflicts resolved, the plane officially headed toward the Bulgarian military base. With Mathieu's professional reminders, the aircraft landed safely. Without delay, the people split into two groups and set off as planned. They found two military vehicles and quickly drove toward their destination. The haste was such that Sylvie even left behind her boyfriend's ashes. However, Mathieu consoled her that if they could just find the shelter, there would be plenty of opportunities to retrieve the ashes. Gallo continued to boast, claiming to be the savior who had saved everyone on the plane and did not deserve such treatment, but was sharply rebuked by Laura. Meanwhile, the vehicle carrying Ayaz and others encountered trouble. The severe injuries often caused Ayaz to lose consciousness, which led to him not noticing an obstacle on the roadside and crashing the car. Now, only 24 minutes remained until sunrise. The car's engine had given up, and the group had no choice but to proceed on foot. In the cold, dark night, Ayaz, holding the little boy, led the survivors on their way. At this time, Sylvie's group had reached the bunker. Just as the gate was about to close, Mathieu led his people to try and stop it, only to discover the door was electrified. The airport janitor was knocked out by the shock. Mathieu then pressed the switch to stop the door, but time was running out. At this critical moment, Gallo volunteered to take Mathieu's place in holding the switch, hoping this act could serve as his redemption. Everyone agreed to Gallo's plan, but Sylvie, mistrusting him, handcuffed Gallo in place and threw the key on the ground, telling him that someone would unlock him later. On the other side, Ayaz and his group came upon an electrified iron fence. The mechanic believed they were going the wrong way and wanted to turn back, but there was no time left. Ayaz decided to take a chance and continue. Horse took a tire off a truck as insulation, and then everyone removed their clothes to climb over the fence. Simultaneously, Sylvie's group arrived at their destination, broke open the gate of the bunker with stones, and seeing that Ayaz's group had not arrived, Sylvie decided to go back for them. With only 3 minutes to sunrise, Ayaz finally made it in time and entered the bunker under Sylvie's lead. However, because Ayaz and the others had not taken the same route as Sylvie's group, the poor Gallo was left trapped in his original location, missing the chance to escape. Watching the rising sun, Gallo felt both rage and despair, helplessly awaiting death. Inside the bunker, Sylvie concealed the fact that she had locked up Gallo and lied, claiming she did not know of his whereabouts. And so, they arrived at the entrance of the Refuge. A group of fully armed soldiers welcomed them. The survivors had finally reached the longed-for sanctuary, no longer needing to live in exile. However, the commanding officer sternly told Sylvie they needed their help. The scene shifts to Zara's memories. Before the disaster struck, Zara had already separated from her son's father and was working as a waitress in a restaurant all by herself. By a twist of fate, her ex-husband showed up at the restaurant one day with his new wife, running into Zara. He had never paid child support, but now things were different. Her son's condition was worsening, and Zara had heard about cutting-edge treatments available in Moscow. For the first time, she swallowed her pride and asked her ex-husband for child support, only to have his new partner show up at her door that evening, berating her and telling her not to expect a penny from them. That's where her flashback ends. Back to the present. Since arriving at the Refuge, people's lives have returned to normal, albeit with their biological clocks completely reversed. Everything takes place within the shelter. Sylvie and Mathieu are cooperating with the military at the Refuge, reaching out to other survivors. Zara's son, the only child at the shelter, is still keeping up with his studies, thanks to the diligent care of Ayaz and others. One day, a fire suddenly breaks out in the base's kitchen. It was caused by Melanie, who accidentally knocked over some oil. The soldiers were complaining about Melanie, but the commander came to her defense. However, the fire was a wake-up call for the shelter. Their food supplies were running low. Mathieu suggested that there was an underground seed vault in Norway that might still have seeds unaffected by the sun. To get there, they would need to retrieve the fuel tanker from the previous military base. Sylvie, feeling uneasy as she remembered Gallo she had doomed, volunteered to look for the fuel tanker. Following that, the commander assigned the seed mission to Captain Marcus, who would lead the team, which included Ayaz and some of the survivors. The commander then reminded everyone that they were in a military facility and had to obey military orders without question. After laying down the law, he cheerfully announced it was time for breakfast. Breakfast was a subdued affair, with people huddled in small groups, quietly discussing their own matters. Ayaz was reassuring a worried Zara that he would make a quick trip and return soon, while the airport janitor and the mechanic discussed Major Gallo's whereabouts. Melanie, due to her good looks, faced some harassment from the hormone-smelling soldiers, sparking another conflict. Meanwhile, in the command room, Mathieu approached Sylvie to remind her that if Gallo's body was discovered, she needed to manage the situation. The astute Mathieu had already sensed that Gallo's disappearance might have something to do with Sylvie. He cautioned her about the potential repercussions, as Gallo was, after all, military personnel. If the shelter's commander found out they had killed a soldier, it could create animosity. An anxious Sylvie chose to head to the Air Force base alone in the middle of the night, but was discovered by the commander. Sensing that Sylvie was harboring a secret, the commander offered to accompany her. Sylvie reluctantly agreed, but then used the excuse of taking the wrong car keys to cancel the trip. Meanwhile, Laura was assisting Horst with his rat experiments. It turns out, since arriving at the base, Horst had been dedicated to developing materials that could shield from solar radiation, using rats as test subjects to cultivate seeds. Laura understood that if they couldn't succeed, their group would lose their value, and the soldiers might drive them away. The scene shifts, and Ayaz finds Zara to tell her that he refused the external mission and had the commander's approval because he loves her and does not want to leave her and her son. The two passionately kiss, but without using their juicy tongues. Zara's son is again helping Horst by catching rats for experiments. The boy enjoys catching rats because Horst rewards him with snacks each time. However, Zara doesn't want her son to come into contact with these potentially harmful animals and takes him back to sleep. In the blink of an eye, the sun is shining brightly outside, and the people in the shelter have fallen into a deep sleep. But the boy, who couldn't sleep, suddenly discovers a rat and follows it outside, trying to catch it. Zara, realizing her son is missing, follows him out, wanting to bring him back, but inadvertently both wander into the shelter's power room and carelessly lock the door behind them. Sylvie, who also hasn't slept, still plans to sneak out, but the commander is keeping an eye on her again. He has always felt that Sylvie is up to something, and just as he prepares to confront her, Zara's cries for help startle them, prompting him and Sylvie to rush to the power room. Inside the power room, the temperature is very high, and for their safety, Sylvie can do nothing but instruct Zara to shut down the generator. Furthermore, as a key area of the shelter, the power room can only be opened from the outside with a key. Zara and her son's situation is extremely perilous. Sylvie instructs the commander to quickly fetch the key, but it turns out the power room is never meant to be closed, and the key's whereabouts are unknown. The soldiers have no choice but to try and ram the door open with a vehicle, but the shelter is built to withstand a nuclear blast, and brute force is ineffective. Zara and her son behind the door are close to suffocation. At this critical juncture, the mechanic thinks of using the high-temperature blowtorch from the airplane to cut open the door. Disaster never comes alone. The shelter's geological layer also experiences a geothermal reaction. Horst warns the commander that if they can't open the power room to activate cooling, everyone will die of heat in the bunker. So the commander heads to the Air Force base to search for the flight, but they find Major Gallo's dead body at the entrance. The commander looks at Sylvie suspiciously. His intuition tells him that Gallo's death is related to Sylvie. Sylvie claims that Gallo may have wanted to help others, but then lost hope and took his own life. Despite the holes in Sylvie's story, now is not the time to pursue the truth. The commander takes off his coat, covers Gallo's body, and continues driving forward. After a long wait, the people in the shelter were starting to get restless. Some were considering giving up on Zara and her son to save everyone else. But Mathieu and Ayaz wouldn't allow this to happen. Zara and her son's condition was deteriorating, and all hope was placed on Sylvie and the others. Unexpectedly, what awaited Sylvie and her team wasn't the plane and blowtorch, but a scene of wreckage and ashes. The commander pointed out gravely that the blowtorch and seeds aren't important now. They now faced a bigger problem. It wasn't an earthquake that destroyed the plane, it was a missile. The scene shifts to a flashback belonging to the nurse Laura. She had once met a humorous Moroccan man during her nursing training program. That evening, the man invited her to his restaurant for dinner. At the table, he made no secret of his fondness for Laura. The two exchanged affectionate glances and hit it off. Just as a beautiful romance was about to blossom, Laura's strict father tracked her down to the restaurant. He opposed his daughter dating a lowly immigrant and after severely humiliating the man, ordered Laura to go home immediately. The flashback ends, and now Laura is outside the power room comforting Zara inside. But the bad news of the plane explosion has already reached the shelter, leaving Captain Marcus in charge. The commander decides to return to the military base's gate to search for the blowtorch. On the way, he suspects that the Russian astronauts and their associated shelter are behind all this. Since proposing a plan 3 days ago to go to Norway in search of seeds, the Russian shelter and the astronauts at the International Space Station have both broken contact with them. The commander suspects that the Russians are also targeting the seeds in Norway and blew up the plane to eliminate competitors. Elsewhere, Melanie has already relayed the bad news to Ayaz under Marcus's command. Hearing that the blowtorch plan was hindered, Zara behind the door looks at the power room's pipe opening and decides to escape with her son. The boy finds a screwdriver in the room, and then Zara uses it to unscrew the pipe's bolts before kicking open the pipe and sending her son into the ventilation shaft. But the boy is struggling. His ventilator was running out of battery a long time ago. Now he is surviving solely on willpower and the encouragement of his mother. However, not everyone is as patient as Ayaz and the others. The soldiers have grown tired of waiting. Thea, who served for NATO before the apocalypse, talks to Horst, hoping he can negotiate with Zara inside the power room to turn on the generator. But still, Horst decides to wait for Sylvie and the others to return. At this point, Sylvie is frantically searching for the blowtorch at the military base. But the commander isn't participating. He's still focused on the surveillance footage of Gallo's corpse. Eventually, he concludes that Sylvie killed Gallo. After sharing his conclusion with the mechanic, they find Sylvie and tell her that the sun is about to rise, and they must abandon the rescue mission and return to the shelter. The soldiers in the shelter couldn't wait any longer. They came to the power room door, guns in hand, ignoring the protests of Richard and Thea. They threatened Laura and Ayaz, demanding that Zara turn on the generator or they would open fire. In the nick of time, Sylvie and the commander returned to the shelter. Ayaz seized the opportunity to fight back as the soldiers were distracted. During the scuffle, gunshots rang out, and to everyone's astonishment, the commander was hit and fell to the ground, bleeding profusely. The commander died like that, and amidst the sorrow, everyone was harboring their own ulterior motives. Thea told the soldiers to put the commander's death aside for the moment and wait for Ayaz and the others to continue the rescue. If it wasn't successful by dawn, they would decide what to do next. The soldiers wanted revenge, but Thea told them that the commander's death was an accident, and the shelter couldn't afford any more internal strife. Outside the door, Ayaz and the janitor brought crowbars and hammers, hoping to pry the door open. Inside, Zara continued to encourage her son to crawl into the pipe. Sylvie was sitting in the dormitory, despairing, convinced that all efforts were in vain. It's all over. The plan to crawl through the ventilation duct isn't working. The little boy is on the brink of death. Ayaz and the janitor outside also realize they can't open the power room door. In despair, Ayaz sends everyone away, leaving only himself to sit outside the door and talk to Zara. This pair of star-crossed lovers, who had only just come together and expressed their love, are now on the brink of being separated by life and death. It's a truly poignant moment. Zara, holding her son's body, comforts Ayaz and delivers her thanks for his help. Then, Zara stood up and turned on the generator. The people in the shelter saw the light again, but their hearts were heavy because they knew what it meant. Zara and her son had really lost all hope of survival. Poor Ayaz knelt outside the door, crying like a desperate baby. In just a few hours, the shelter had lost 3 members, all gone without explanation. But life had to go on. The power room's fuel could only last a few hours, so they decided to go to town to collect fuel and tools, figuring out a way to get into the power room. Mathieu suggested heading to the nearest airport to retrieve a plane. The seed project was of the utmost importance because if the Russians had taken all the seeds, everyone would starve. The tragic day came to an end. Horst was writing in his diary on the bed. Ayaz was still spiritless for the loss of Zara, but not her son. Laura sat comforting him outside his door. Ayaz's behavior reminded Laura of the man who had been harmed by his father and herself. She hated herself for not having the courage to stand up to her father like Ayaz did. Elsewhere, the mechanic found Sylvie and inquired about Gallo's death. Sylvie got straight to the point, admitting that Gallo died by her hand, but it wasn't intentional, and she did it for the good of everyone. The mechanic believed Sylvie, but he feared that once the soldiers in the shelter found out, they would seek revenge on her. And as if the mechanic had jinxed it, his fears came true. While the soldiers were handling the commander's body, they found a USB drive in his pocket. Upon inserting it into a computer, they watched a video of Sylvie locking up Gallo and inadvertently causing his death. The soldier claimed in anger that they must have their vengeance. The scene shifts to a flashback of Melanie. From these recollections, we could learn that Melanie had just returned home from the hospital. She has a brother who is suspected of being gay. Melanie began packing her bags to leave home, which slightly disappointed her father. Melanie told him that she was going to Brussels for business, but her father seemed to know his daughter's true intentions and asked if she was going to see her boyfriend. Melanie became nervous, and her father immediately warned her that the guy was a scoundrel and not worthy of her. Melanie, however, seemed unable to extricate herself from her boyfriend. Now, Melanie sat outside, secretly observing the soldiers burying the commander's body. These soldiers had always looked down upon the new survivors, and now they were venting their dissatisfaction by calling Sylvie a blood-sucking tick. Before long, those who had gone to town to look for fuel and lock-picking tools returned. Richard opened the door to the power room and discovered the bodies of Zara and her son, feeling a deep sense of regret. Ayaz still sat in the dormitory, lost in thought, while Laura continued to sit outside with him. Then, Captain Marcus came by with some items and asked Laura to inform Ayaz that the power room had been opened and they were preparing a funeral to bury the mother and son's bodies. Ayaz heard the news but didn't move. Instead, he told Laura despondently that he believed God had him board that flight as punishment for everything he had done, which implies that Ayaz might have committed some unforgivable crime before. Meanwhile, the others were gathering to discuss the next mission assignments. Thea planned to go with Mathieu and Captain Marcus to find a plane, while the mechanic and the janitor were tasked with finding fuel. Also, Mathieu hoped Sylvie would join his group since having an extra pilot could only be beneficial. However, 2 NATO soldiers wanted to keep Sylvie in the shelter, claiming she was the leader of the survivors and couldn't leave. Clearly, the soldiers had their own agenda, but Sylvie agreed to stay anyway. The rest decided to set out after the funeral. At the funeral, Thea kept glancing at her watch, eager to set off for Norway sooner rather than later. However, the mechanic scolded her for her lack of respect for the deceased. Then, Ayaz arrived unexpectedly. Claiming to have pulled himself together, Ayaz told everyone not to dwell at the funeral but instead to move forward. Afterward, Ayaz volunteered to take on the task of searching for fuel. However, Sylvie and Mathieu both felt that something was off, wondering if Ayaz was plotting something against Thea, who was indirectly responsible for Zara's death. The scene shifts, and Captain Marcus once again finds Melanie, the beautiful girl he truly liked. Not only did he bring her new clothes from town, but he also wrote her a letter, saying that if he didn't return from Norway, she should open it and read what he wanted to tell her. But Melanie seemed unwilling to focus on romance, especially since 3 people had just died. She walked away, visibly annoyed. Meanwhile, Thea found the leading soldier who was boxing and reminded him not to cause trouble, especially with the survivors. However, it seemed the soldier was determined to stir up issues. At the same time, Laura felt that Ayaz's sudden change of attitude was abnormal and cautioned the janitor to keep a close eye on him. Elsewhere, the soldiers were holding a military funeral for the commander. After the service, the leading soldier approached an ambassador, hinting that he should choose his side carefully as a conflict seemed imminent. At this time, pilot Mathieu had already set off with Thea and 2 others in search of an airplane. The mechanic openly expressed his dislike for Thea, calling her a NATO fool, leaving her speechless and creating an awkward atmosphere. But now they had arrived at the airport, where Mathieu realized all the planes were too small for the journey to Norway. The group went deeper into the airport, hoping to find a larger aircraft, but instead discovered several luxury sports cars. Mathieu mentioned that there was another airport further north they could try. Marcus, unable to take his eyes off the sports cars, suggested they drive them to their next destination. The camera returns to the base where the ambassador is discussing with Sylvie how to allocate Zara and the commander's rooms, only to find that a soldier has already forcefully moved in. Sylvie found the leading soldier and told him that Ayaz had been through a lot of pain and was still taking risks for the shelter. She pleaded for a bit of humanity and to show him some kindness. The leading soldier stared at Sylvie intently but eventually seemed to agree to her proposal. The scene shifts, and the janitor is now departing with Ayaz. In the car, Ayaz tells the janitor that he can actually understand Thea, but it was those NATO soldiers who hated Zara and the others, who pressured them to turn on the generator out of selfish motives. His revenge was aimed at those soldiers. Meanwhile, the janitor receives a call from Mathieu and the others, learning that their search for an airplane was thwarted. He then tells Ayaz that they too must go to another airport to meet up with Mathieu's group and head to Norway together. Ayaz is taken aback but raises no objections. Turning to Marcus, he joyously sped down the road in a sports car. Fortunately, looking for another plane did not take too much time. Mathieu finds a slightly larger plane which might serve as a means of travel if the seats were removed. Mathieu rushes into the cabin to inspect it, only to find 2 rotting corpses in the cockpit, with a small baby even in the woman's arms. The scene is distressing for all 3 of them, but they know they must continue their mission. The 4 of them disembark from the plane, waiting for the janitor and Ayaz to bring them fuel. At last, Ayaz and the janitor arrive. They quickly fuel up the plane, and then Mathieu and Marcus enter the cockpit. The plane begins its journey to Norway, flying into the vast night. The camera once again returns to the base. Laura finds Horst, who is still conducting cultivation experiments, hoping to talk to him alone. She notices that Horst's mental state has been poor lately, even losing hope in the experiments. This is not good. Horst, seeing no alternative, confesses that because he loves her, but she loves Ayaz. After saying this, Horst walks away. However, Laura later finds Horst and tells him that she doesn't like Ayaz. From the beginning to the end, it has only been Horst she cared for. Just as the 2 are about to wrestle their tongues, the leading soldier cuts off their smelly tongues and calls them away. Elsewhere, Richard, who is working out on his little mustache rather than his muscles, is approached by the blonde soldier who wants to take him to the control room to show him something. Richard is taken away. At the same time, Melanie and Sylvie learn that the plane has successfully taken off and happily high-five each other. They prepare to share the good news with others, but what awaits them is not applause, but Laura, Horst, and Richard being guarded by soldiers. Sylvie steps forward to argue, questioning the leading soldier why he is doing this. The leading soldier smiles, saying that today he will judge the murderer who plotted against a NATO officer. The ambassador plays back a segment of surveillance footage, showing the person plotting against Gallo is Sylvie. The leading soldier laughs, thinking he has the upper hand, but Sylvie calmly denies, saying it's all a misunderstanding. The scene shifts to a flashback of a Russian girl with mania, who will appear in the later story. Back to the present, Mathieu and the others are on the plane, discussing how to deal with the Russians lurking in the shadows. Since the Russian astronaut voluntarily cut off contact, they've lost touch with the Russians, leaving the survivors in a passive situation. Mathieu thinks they can negotiate with the Russians to share the seeds, but Marcus believes the chances of a peaceful resolution are slim. They call Ayaz over to discuss. Ayaz reassures them not to worry. As long as there aren't too many of them, there's no threat because he secretly brought a gun from the shelter. Then, due to his nerves, Marcus starts breathing heavily. Mathieu, not wanting to disrupt the flight, suggests Marcus talks to his sweetheart Melanie, not knowing she's already been captured. The scene switches back to the shelter, where Melanie and the others are being held and interrogated separately by the soldiers. Melanie adamantly claims ignorance, while Horst suggests that the video evidence might not show the whole truth. Richard plays both sides, saying Gallo has made many mistakes, but Sylvie shouldn't have acted the way she did. Despite the pressure, Sylvie remains unyielding, insisting on her right to defend herself. The leading soldier confronts her menacingly, revealing that he intentionally separated Ayaz and the others to leave Sylvie without allies. Meanwhile, pilot Mathieu and his group are about to land. There's no sign of the Russians at the Norwegian airport. They hurry off the plane and drive to the seed vault's entrance, where they find 2 bodies frozen solid. After a brief moment of mourning, they enter the vault, only to encounter another security door. The keycard to unlock it is likely on the 2 bodies they just found. With daybreak upon them, Ayaz decides to wait inside the frigid seed vault until sunset before venturing out again. Back at the shelter, the soldiers lock Sylvie and the others in a room. Laura, Melanie, and Horst stand by Sylvie firmly, but only Richard thinks that murder is a sin. At this point, the ambassador finds them, saying he can help convince the leading soldier to temporarily spare Sylvie until the others return to make a decision. But Sylvie and her group must show that they are cooperative allies. In this apocalypse, relationships are only between allies and enemies. After saying this, the ambassador goes back to report to the leading soldier, while Sylvie and her group discuss whether the ambassador's words can be trusted. However, the leading soldier doesn't concern himself with this. He's gradually become the top figure in the shelter and decides to do something he's never had the chance to do before, to organize a party. During the party, the blonde soldier finds it too boring and decides to spice things up. He approaches Sylvie and takes Richard and Horst away with unclear intentions. On the other side, Ayaz, who was resting in the seed base, suddenly woke up to find a pistol aimed at his head. The owner of the pistol turned out to be the Russian girl who appeared in the previous flashback. Ayaz and his companions realized that the girl's mental state was not stable, and they carefully made it clear that they meant no harm. The girl was a file keeper for the World Food Program who had been alone in the seed base for over 5 weeks. She had believed that a sudden outbreak of chemical warfare had killed everyone outside. The file keeper gradually calmed down, and she agreed to Mathieu and the others' request to enter the seed vault. However, upon entering, they were shocked to find the vault in disarray. The file keeper had been surviving by consuming the seeds and had long since lost her sanity. Ayaz found an empty bottle of antipsychotic medication in the seed vault. Given that the girl already had bipolar disorder and had been alone in the seed vault for 1 or 2 months, it was no surprise that she might become delusional. Mathieu instructed Ayaz to inform Captain Marcus to contact Melanie and tell them they would be returning earlier than planned and that they also intended to bring the file keeper back. But Thea told the two that the girl had no desire to leave and disagreed with them taking the seeds. Back at the shelter, Horst and Richard were forced by the soldiers to put on boxing gloves. They were made to fight each other, the 2 weakest men in terms of combat in the shelter, amid a chorus of jeers. When the leading soldier made a joke about Horst's woman, Horst punched him in a fit of anger. This was a bad move as he was no match for the well-trained soldier. The leading soldier took off his shirt and beat Horst to shit his pants, nearly killing him. Thankfully, the ambassador rushed out, claiming that Horst was still valuable for seed cultivation, and pulled the leading soldier away. The other soldiers then threw the unconscious Horst back and took the enraged Sylvie to solitary confinement. Additionally, the leading soldier continued to divide and conquer by cozying up to Richard over a meal. Suddenly, a female soldier came with bad news. Marcus had said over the radio that they would return from Norway earlier than planned and kept asking where his favorite girl Melanie was, and a soldier had let slip that Melanie was detained. Knowing that, the blonde soldier's expression darkened as he said he would handle the situation, while the leading soldier continued his manipulative tactics. He handed the keys to the various rooms to Richard, ostensibly to deliver food to the survivors. His clear intention was to turn the survivors against Richard, causing internal conflict. The naive Richard thought the soldiers were treating him as an intermediary. Upon seeing that Richard had the keys, Sylvie asked him to release all the survivors that night. She needed to find a gun to ensure they could defend themselves, but Richard quickly closed the door. He still thought the soldiers just wanted to vent their anger and told Sylvie not to resist. Sylvie urged Richard to abandon his illusions and face reality. There could be no peaceful coexistence between the survivors and the soldiers. The blonde soldier found Melanie and wanted to take her sexy body away. He had long harbored hormone desires for the beautiful Melanie. Laura and Horst stood guard protectively around Melanie. The blonde soldier swore in frustration. He only intended to have Melanie respond to a radio message. However, the blonde soldier pointed a gun at Melanie's head and threatened her to tell Marcus that nothing had happened at the shelter. Suddenly, Melanie took advantage of the soldier's distraction and kicked him hard in the groin. She then informed Captain Marcus that the soldiers in the shelter had gone mad and urged them to return quickly. Afterward, she ran towards the outside of the shelter. The blonde soldier aimed his pistol at Melanie as she fled, but ultimately didn't shoot because in his eyes, Melanie was already as good as dead. The blonde soldier returned to the shelter and locked the main door. The scene shifts to the memories of the NATO employee, Thea. It turns out at the very beginning of the disaster, she and the ambassador were notified of the news. Now they needed to catch the flight to the Bulgarian shelter. Thea couldn't even tell her neighbors about the impending disaster, only claiming she was going on a trip. All Thea could do was leave her cat with her neighbor. Then she left in tears. Back to the present, Ayaz and his group were in the seed vault discussing their plan. The message Melanie risked her life to send made them choose their next steps cautiously. After deliberation, everyone agreed to return to the shelter as soon as possible. They also decided to take the file keeper back with them. Leaving a living person behind would weigh on their conscience. So they put on their masks, deciding to go along with the girl's belief that there was toxic gas outside and that they could take her back to see her daughter. After much thought, the girl finally agreed to leave with them. But just as they were leaving, an accident happened. Since Melanie sent the message, only Marcus and Ayaz were present. Now, with Marcus staying on the plane, Ayaz was the only one who knew the truth. The janitor, knowing Ayaz's desire for revenge against the soldiers, suspected that Ayaz was fabricating false news to rush them back to the shelter. Ayaz got angry upon hearing this since he hadn't lied. In his anger, he slapped the janitor, knocking off his mask. Things went downhill from there. The file keeper, seeing the janitor's mask fall off and he was still alive, freaked out, feeling deceived, and then ran away screaming in a chicken voice. Helpless, Ayaz and his group had no choice but to chase after the girl. On the other side, Richard came again to bring food to Horst and Laura. Horst inquired about the whereabouts of Melanie after the blonde soldier had taken her. Richard was unaware of this matter. However, he relayed Sylvie's plan to the two of them. Horst, blinded by rage, said that Sylvie should just take a gun and kill all the soldiers. Laura, however, was constantly soothing him. Then she asked Richard to find out from the blonde soldier where Melanie had gone. At that moment, the distraught Melanie was outside the shelter, knocking on the door, begging the soldiers to let her in. But there was no response. Richard then found the blonde soldier, who lied that Melanie had gone into town to look for supplies. Richard didn't believe this obvious lie. The blonde soldier sneered and asked him not to worry about Melanie anymore. Hearing this, Richard trembled and walked out. He found the ambassador and told him the shelter was facing a serious crisis. He didn't want a riot to happen. The ambassador feigned agreement, then took Richard to the leading soldier. Unexpectedly, he betrayed Richard by telling the leading soldier that Sylvie planned to start a riot that night. The leading soldier feigned concern, patting Richard on the shoulder, saying he would handle it well. The scene shifts, and we see Melanie driving a truck away from the shelter, desperately searching for a place to stay. Suddenly, she sees light coming from a building on the side of the road. There were still people outside. Melanie was both shocked and overjoyed. She drove to the house, cautiously entered with a flashlight, and found darkness and silence inside. She opened the bedroom door and discovered 2 dead babies inside. It turned out there were no living people. The light was from a rotating lamp beside the baby cribs. In the master bedroom lay the deceased parents of the babies. Melanie clenched her teeth and moved the food from the house, but the food had spoiled due to solar mutations. It had no nutrients and was hard to swallow. Melanie threw away the food and took out the letter that Marcus had given her before he left. As she was reading Marcus's heartfelt words with mixed emotions, Melanie suddenly heard the sound of a helicopter outside. She ran out the door and saw a helicopter flying past. Without a moment to think, Melanie drove the truck and followed it. The camera returns to Norway, where Marcus and the janitor are refueling the plane. Ayaz had already captured the girl and strapped her to a seat. The filekeeper now believed the truth about the son, but then told Ayaz in despair that if it was true, it meant all the people she loved were dead. She would rather die with them, asking Ayaz why he would like to save her. Ayaz replied that saving lives is the only way to maintain humanity in the apocalypse. Even if she can't find a reason to survive, she must live on. That's what it means to be human. On the other side, Laura and Horst were still inside the shelter, waiting for Sylvie to implement her plan. Sylvie had been waiting for Richard to open the door for her. And indeed, a set of keys was sent through the door. What Sylvie hadn't expected, however, was that the keys were intentionally given to her by the soldiers as a trap. Sylvie found Horst and Laura, but Laura was unwilling to take the risk. She felt that Horst just wanted revenge against the blonde soldier who had beaten him up. However, Sylvie still forcefully brought Laura to her side. Suddenly, Laura heard a noise from next door. It was Richard, who was tied up and wailing like a goose. But Sylvie did not go to check, and instead continued with her plan. When she opened the box containing guns, she found it empty. And as a stern warning came from behind, Sylvie realized she had likely fallen into a trap. The leading soldier looked smug as the ambassador reprimanded Sylvie in a sycophantic manner. The soldiers then decided to detain the three of them along with Richard. Turning to Melanie, she had followed the helicopter to its destination. 2 Russian soldiers disembarked from the plane, guns drawn and pointed at Melanie. They questioned whether Melanie was from NATO and why she wanted to blow up their plane. Melanie denied knowing that fact and quickly took in this unexpected news. She then blamed the bombing on the NATO soldiers in the shelter, calling them the bad guys who had expelled her. She offered to lead the way to the shelter. It appeared that Melanie was looking to use the Russians to exact her revenge against the NATO soldiers. After some thought, the Russian soldiers decided to follow Melanie for retribution. So just as Sylvie and the others were being captured without a fight inside the shelter, Melanie had brought the Russian soldiers to the shelter's doorstep. They blew the door open with explosives and stormed in. Melanie secretly grabbed a radio, intending to contact Marcus and the others. Ayaz heard the radio and rushed to the cockpit to respond. He learned about the situation in the shelter and Melanie bringing the Russian soldiers. He urged Melanie to hold on, saying they were about to depart. Ayaz hurried out to inform the others, but failed to notice that he had left his tools in the cockpit. Meanwhile, the leading soldier handed a handgun to the ambassador. If other survivors returned, they would undoubtedly blame the soldiers, so the ambassador was to execute Sylvie. This would deter others from causing trouble. As Sylvie was being transported, suddenly a burst of gunshots was heard. The soldiers left to investigate. Back at the plane, the filekeeper had managed to get hold of the tools and freed herself from the tape. Her bipolar disorder and mental illness flared up again. Unbeknownst to the people outside still working on the plane, Mathieu suddenly spotted the filekeeper's figure in the cockpit. Realizing something was terribly wrong, the three rushed onto the plane, but it was too late. The girl had locked herself in the cockpit, declaring she wouldn't go anywhere while smashing the control panel with a fire extinguisher. The plane was destroyed by her crazed actions. The mechanic and Ayaz didn't know what they should do next. The scene shifts to a flashback of Horst, who works in the Climate and Energy Department of the European Economic Area. He was romantically involved with his supervisor, and they had planned a trip to Moscow together. However, the supervisor ended their relationship that day, claiming she had lost her feelings for him. Devastated, Horst left the office with his work documents, declaring he would work from home for a while, and ignored an urgent phone call, which was likely about the solar mutation. Returning to the present, the ambassador is shocked as he holds a gun and tells the leading soldier that he once believed NATO could bring peace, implying his inability to accept the leading soldier's actions. Tragically, Russians burst in and shoot the ambassador, instantly killing him. The leading soldier pleads with the Russians to explain what is going on after they angrily question why their plane and bunker were destroyed by NATO. Melanie steps forward as the soldiers who escorted Sylvie arrive, leading to a tense standoff. Sylvie is now fleeing in a corridor, but she is eventually captured. Melanie and Sylvie, along with others, are locked in a room where Horst can't identify the strange soldiers. Melanie reluctantly admits she brought the Russians, but stays silent about NATO soldiers destroying the Russian plane, fearing trouble for herself. Sylvie tells the others that it was her actions that led to their capture and reveals that she was wounded by the soldiers. With no better option, they decide to wait for Ayaz to return, but he and the others can't even access the cockpit. Meanwhile, the janitor suggests removing the cockpit window from the outside to repair the control panel and then reinstalling it. But first, they need to calm down the file keeper, who is too upset to listen to reason. Mathieu emphasized the need to find the tools to remove the window as their top priority. They stop arguing and leave to find the tools, while Thea volunteers to stay behind and try to persuade the girl to open the door. She shares her own experiences, explaining that people can change, and the survivors have become more important to her in this post-apocalyptic world. She believes the girl can also find hope again, but the file keeper remains unyielding, crying and smashing things, driving even Thea to desperation. Back to the shelter, NATO soldiers have already sat down to negotiate peace with the Russians. Although a conflict has been temporarily averted, the Russians do not trust them completely. No one knows for sure if it was the NATO soldiers who blew up the plane. The leading soldier is just as puzzled as the Russians, wondering who has the power to destroy their weapons and why they would do such a thing. They pore over the map in the command center, trying to deduce the identity of this mysterious force. Unbeknownst to anyone, deep in the chilly Atlantic, a submarine moves stealthily forward. Afterward, Mathieu and the others have returned, and as expected, Thea has failed in her task. They have also failed to find the tools they need. With the sunrise fast approaching, Mathieu tells Thea they must give up on the file keeper and retreat to the seed vault. They'll wait for the sunset the next day before coming out again to find the tools to remove the window and fix the plane to return to the shelter. Thea is devastated. Before the disaster, she was all about surviving alone, having to abandon everyone close to her. Now, she faces the prospect of leaving another life behind. Through tears, she says maybe the file keeper is right, that she isn't crazy after all. What's the point of living if you can't be with the ones you love? Thea contemplates staying and seeking death as well, but Mathieu reminds her that many people now depend on her. Her life is no longer just about her. Ultimately, Thea doesn't have the courage to leave the girl behind. The sun is rising quickly. In the shelter, Sylvie and the others realize there must have been an incident in Norway. Suddenly, the leading soldier finds her and announces that there will be a public trial that evening. Sylvie pleads, insisting that she alone is to blame and not to harm the innocent. The leading soldier gives a mocking smile and locks the door. Sylvie fears that all the survivors will be executed. They must save themselves. Horst suggests they escape the shelter and find the Russian plane to fly to Norway, especially since Russian helicopter engines mostly use a type of fuel not affected by the solar mutation, so there's no need to worry about range. The only problem now is how to escape. Sylvie looks up and spots a ventilated duct with a gridded fence overhead. She decides they can crawl out through the duct, but they need a blowtorch to open the fence. There's no blowtorch in the room, but Horst says he can make a simple one. After some hustle, the homemade blowtorch is ready. Horst uses it to burn through the vent cover, while Laura keeps watch at the door. After some coordination, they all crawl through the duct, passing sleeping soldiers, and reach the end. However, they discover there are 2 more soldiers outside. It's the only way out. To escape their predicament, Sylvie decides to cut the power to the shelter and use the night vision goggles played by the deceased boy to navigate their way out of the shelter. On the other side, the sun had already set. The file keeper in the cockpit had long since passed away. On her phone, there was still a video of her beloved daughter's birthday, which was truly heart-wrenching. Mathieu approached the window, intending to continue planning, but the mysterious submarine that appeared earlier had already arrived in Norway. Back in the shelter, Sylvie had gone to the power room to turn off the electricity. The startled soldiers thought there was another generator malfunction and fumbled in the dark to investigate. Sylvie and the others lined up and stealthily made their way through the soldiers, not daring to make a sound. The blonde soldier, using a flashlight, arrived at the power room and turned the generator back on. However, the leading soldier noticed the bloodstains left by Richard on the ground. He realized something was off. By this time, Sylvie had already led everyone out of the shelter. They used a jeep to block the door that the Russians had destroyed. By the time the soldiers rushed out of the shelter, Sylvie and the group had already driven away. On the road, Melanie tried to contact Mathieu and the others, but the plane was destroyed and the radio was inoperable. Melanie couldn't reach anyone, and Richard's condition was getting more and more serious. His life was hanging by a thread. Meanwhile, Mathieu and the others had entered the cockpit. After mourning the file keeper, Mathieu slumped in his seat, saying the plane was beyond repair. The mechanic, still hopeful, suggested that since the Russians said a mysterious force had destroyed the plane, that force might come for the seeds. They could persuade them to rescue everyone. If the plane couldn't land, they would clear the runway. If no one came, they would make their own parts and repair the control panel. The mechanic encouraged Mathieu not to give up hope. But Mathieu had already accepted defeat. Nothing more could be done. At that moment, Ayaz was standing at the seed vault entrance with a steely expression. After hearing from the janitor that they couldn't take off for the time being, he threw down the walkie-talkie and entered the seed vault. He found Marcus, who was busy with the seeds, and told him they were now trapped here. He had planned to deal with this matter after returning, but it seemed they had to resolve it on the spot now. It turns out, the letter Marcus wrote to Melanie contained shocking news. Melanie had relayed this news to Ayaz during their recent contact. Zara and her son were intentionally locked in the power room by Marcus under the direction of the commander. The commander just wanted to scare the unruly Zara, but he hadn't anticipated the key to the power room going missing. After the tragedy occurred, Marcus was also distraught, but Ayaz wouldn't listen to his explanation. Drawing his pistol, he ordered Marcus to kneel. At that moment, a mysterious man in an overcoat entered the seed vault. When he saw Ayaz, he shouted not to shoot. There was a submarine outside, and he was one of the crew members. Marcus took the opportunity to escape. In a rage, Ayaz turned his anger on the stranger and fired a gunshot. The scene abruptly cuts to Sylvie's group. Now, they had located the Russian helicopter and were preparing to take off. However, the soldiers from the shelter, along with the Russians, followed them in pursuit. In a rush, Sylvie started up the helicopter, but it would take a minute to get airborne. Richard stepped down from the helicopter, deciding to sacrifice himself. He drove off in a fuel tanker to draw their attention, buying time for Sylvie and the others. Although Sylvie was reluctant to leave him, she had no choice but to take off with a heavy heart. Shortly after, the leading soldier spotted the helicopter and began to attack it frantically with their rifles. Unexpectedly, Richard, resigned to his fate, drove the fuel tanker straight at them. Amidst the explosion, he and the soldiers met their end together. Sylvie and her companions flew towards the distance, mourning their loss. Meanwhile, back at the shelter, the other soldiers were suddenly elated to find that one of the rats used for experiments by Horst had survived, which indicates that the sunlight could be blocked and the sun mutation could be negated. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.